In the middle part of Chapter 2 of Methodical Realism, Gilson will look closely for the source of Noel's error about Mercier. In doing this, he will also look more closely at Noel's own immediate realism. This section of the book is about 12 pages long, and it involves some inside baseball between 1930s French neo-Thomists. I think it could be skipped without losing too much of the effect of the overall book. Assuming Mercier's proof requires an inference, why does Noel claim that Mercier does not require an inference? Why does Noel misread Mercier in this way? Gilson suggests that it is because Mercier uses the word existence sometimes when he means reality and sometimes when he means the non-self. This is the ambiguity that allows Noel and others to call Mercier an immediate realist. For the next 6 or 7 pages, Gilson will conduct a close reading of Mercier and Noel to identify the errors that Noel makes. In some places, Mercier writes existence where he seems to mean reality. Gilson notes that for Mercier, sensation does posit the reality of a non-self, but, he says, this is only an inner or mental reality, which does not guarantee its existence outside the mind. Mercier requires the principle of causality, then, to link the inner reality to the outer reality. On this point, Noel either misreads Mercier or agrees that Mercier's realism is mediate and not immediate. In some places, Mercier writes existence where he seems to mean the non-self. Noel claims that this means that Mercier takes the non-self as a primary datum of sensation, and Gilson agrees, but he says the datum is an internal or mental non-self only. If Noel were correct, Gilson asks, what would be the purpose of Mercier's invoking the principle of causality? Noel says that Mercier uses the principle of causality to establish the existence of things in themselves. In other words, Mercier uses it to link the existence of phenomena to the existence of noumena. Gilson's question then for Noel is, are these two things or just one thing? If they are a single thing, then the principle of identity would be sufficient to infer the existence of one from the other, they being the same thing. If they are two distinct things, then it would be impossible to infer one's existence from the others. Noel seems to hold that the phenomenon is the thing in itself insofar as it is given to consciousness, and if this is correct, then Mercier really is an immediate realist. But, Gilson asks, will Mercier's texts bear this reading? Mercier, Gilson notes, explicitly distinguishes between two relationships, the relationship between reality and intellect on one side, in the act of knowing, and the relationship between the knowing self and the known non-self on the other side. The reason for this distinction is that Mercier recognizes that the existence of the non-self is different from the existence of the self. Now, in the act of knowing, the subject and object are united, but the known object is posited as extramentally real in the act of knowing. In my act of knowing, there are two existences then. There's the existence of myself, including my mental images and thoughts and sensations, and the existence of the object. Subject and object do not become a numerical identity in the act of knowing. Instead, the being of the subject participates in the actuality of the object without becoming it. That is to say that their identity is formal and not numerical. Gilson writes, if this is how things really are, the possibility of deriving the proof of the external world's existence from immediate realism seems doubtful. And this is because the being of the phenomenon is at bottom the being of the knowing subject. I would say that the phenomenon is an event in the subject's mind. It takes part in that subject's act of existence. Gilson writes, a common act in the order of intentionality cannot transform itself into a common act in the order of existence. On the contrary, it presupposes two distinct existences. I think that single quote is really the heart of Gilson's critique of Mercier. Assuming that Mercier requires an inference to arrive at the existence of the outside world, Gilson reasons, if the inference is from the thing in itself, known as phenomenon, to the thing in itself as itself, then Mercier is an immediate realist, but then no proof is needed. And if the inference is from the phenomenal being to another type of being that has its own separate existence, then Mercier has a proof, but it must be immediate realist proof, analogous to Descartes'. Gilson then turns to evaluate Noel's immediate realism. He begins by observing that for the immediate realist, the external world is not proved, but is found or shown. So he asks, how can it be shown, and is Noel's method the best way of showing it? So he begins by grasping the method. Noel's method starts from the immediate data of consciousness, accepted as such. The advantage of this starting point is it allows one to build bridges with modern epistemologists. Gilson pauses to note that the immediate realist, like Noel, is not a skeptic about the external world. He simply seeks to show how the existence of the external world follows from the universal experience of subjective consciousness. Gilson does note that we should be shown why such a detour is necessary, why we can't simply begin with the external world. Reality, according to Noel, presents itself to us as a whole, as a block, simply as apprehended reality. Noel then proposes to consider the whole merely as the apprehended, to consider just this one aspect of what we are presented with. Gilson quips, the plan seems to be to consider the apprehended without the reality. So what does this mean, Gilson asks, to isolate the apprehended from the apprehended reality? Well, it cannot mean the act of apprehension itself, because this would require moving from I think to an external reality. It must then mean a judgment of existence independent of the identity of the existing thing. In that case, Noel's formula means that we apprehend before making an existential judgment. And this is fine, according to Gilson, since the apprehended simply is the existing object present to the mind as knowledge. And this is why Noel thinks that neither he nor Mercier needs the principle of causality. Gilson writes, if the sense of an inner experience one starts with includes the existence of the real itself, then the principle of causality will no longer be invoked at a later point to establish that existence. That is to say, that existence will be present from the beginning. And from the beginning, Noel's consciousness grasps the real. This leaves some remaining questions, though. Is Noel's method the best method of showing the reality of the external world? And does it in fact make dialogue with modern philosophers easier? Gilson thinks not on both questions. One reason is that Noel's method will inevitably be compared to Descartes' method, and this will introduce a serious misunderstanding. Modern interlocutors will assume that Noel is simply a confused Cartesian. And the reason for this is that Descartes' cogito excludes by definition everything that is not thought. And that's why Descartes needs to appeal to the principle of causality to return to the external world. By contrast, Noel's starting point, his cogito, begins with an immediate grasp of a reality outside the self. Noel's cogito, then, Gilson writes, has the task, therefore, of introducing everything which in Descartes' system, it, the cogito, was designed to exclude. And this confusion alone seems that it will wreck any attempt to build bridges with post-Cartesian epistemologists. Gilson wraps up his consideration of Noel's view by noting that idealists and realists, including Noel, have fundamentally different starting assumptions, and there's little to be gained by mixing systems and terms. Noel runs the serious risk of being misunderstood, and indeed he has already been misunderstood and accused by his critics of being an idealist. Gilson also says that Noel's thought is not in keeping with the spirit of Thomism. He writes, to treat what is apprehended as separate from reality, even if only as part of a methodological device, is to do the opposite of what St. Thomas always did. And the next section, pages 52 to 58, is titled The Thomistic Method. Gilson promises that here he will explain why St. Thomas started his theory of knowledge from reality, not from the apprehended, and not from God. We'll turn to that section next.